Great. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon. Just a quick word about the EA. We are a learned society and subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through secondary and further education to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you ever so much to Elizabeth for chairing tonight's conversation and to Claire and Ian for coming along and sharing your ideas with us so generously. We really do appreciate it. Our members also make it possible for us to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please do consider joining us. It costs just £55 to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to hand over to tonight's speakers to get us on to the good stuff. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Okay. Hello, welcome everyone. I am absolutely delighted to be here tonight and to introduce the Thinking Forwards series event this evening, which is part of the EA's initiative to develop the national conversation about English and what's going on with our subject. And we have two fantastic speakers, Ian Cushing and Clare Feeney, and they're going to be exploring, as I'm sure you're all aware, linguistic prejudice and critical language awareness in schools and at university level. But the magic of this event is about the collaboration between universities and schools. Ian coming from the university, which he'll explain in a minute, and Claire from schools, which she will also explain. It's groundbreaking. It's had a groundbreaking impact on teaching practice and student engagement. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing all about it, as I'm sure you are. So first of all, Ian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks very much for inviting us. It's a real privilege to be here and do this with my good friend and colleague, Claire. So my name's Ian Cushing. I'm a senior lecturer in critical applied linguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University. Before I became an academic, I was a secondary school English teacher for about 7 years or so, mostly in London. And my experiences of a school teacher has really shaped my research agenda today. So most of my work now is all about documenting and dismantling linguistic injustice in schools. And I guess a lot of my early work was about the first strand of that, documenting linguistic injustice. And in recent years, I've shifted to the second strand, so the dismantling of linguistic injustice in schools. And I've always collaborated really closely with teachers as part of those efforts, including Claire, in the development of things like anti-racist language policies and pedagogies and the development of critical language awareness in schools. And I run a summer school for teachers on linguistic justice as part of that work as well.
Claire.
Thank you. So also a huge thank you to Elizabeth for inviting us along tonight to speak about a collaboration. So I'm a high school teacher, secondary school teacher. I've been teaching since the 1990s and I'm an English teacher. I've always championed teaching about spoken language in the classroom. And I've done that Key Stage 3, where possible Key Stage 4, and through the A-level language at Key Stage 5 as well. And I would say the recent collaboration with Ian and a few other people as well has really reinvigorated and refreshed the approach that we take towards teaching about spoken language. So we would now say we do it much more critically, and I'll probably talk a lot more about that during tonight's session. But it has really been a highlight of my career, really thinking about this important work and trying to embed some of that in a high school setting with my colleagues, my English colleagues. I'm teaching and learning lead at my school, and it's a large secondary school. We're in the northeast of England, based in North Tyneside.
Thank you very much. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to kickstart with the very first question, which I will invite Ian to start off by responding to it. So it's, how did your collaboration come about? and how are you holding that collaboration together?
Okay. It's been the highlight of my career collaborating with Claire as well, I must say as well. Like it really has. Like, I've learned so much from Claire and part of the teachers that we work with as well. So how did our collaboration come about? So um, I was looking through some of my emails and my Twitter messages to try and like think about the first contact that I had with Claire, and it was back in February 2020. And it was about an assembly, Claire, that you'd given on the policing of language in schools. And that came at a time where, like many schools in the country, were attracting like national media coverage because of quite overtly punitive and quite hostile language policing in schools and very explicit, often very racist, the policing of language in schools. So Claire had done this amazing assembly that she'd done to kind of push back against that, and she shared it on Twitter and with me. So we got in touch about that, about because we obviously had some shared interests. And I guess like many teachers, but not all of them, Claire was one of the teachers who really took a very firm stand against that and wanted to do something about it. And as it happened with some other teachers who were named as co-researchers, I'd recently won some funding from the British Educational Research Association and the UK Literacy Association, just small pots of money, about challenging language discrimination in schools and trying to kind of co-produce some like pedagogical principles for doing critical language and anti-racist language work in schools. And I shared that work with Claire after seeing the kind of work that she was doing, and it seemed to really resonate with her. And Claire was able to then start drawing on some of that research in her practice. So those kind of initial conversations started like a really nice, productive loop of doing research together and collaborating together with teachers on issues of linguistic injustice, and crucially, where teachers were then able to take that research and influence their practice and, really kind of see and embed that research being implemented in their classrooms, like Claire just mentioned. So shortly after that, then me and a colleague at the English and Media Centre, who have really long championed issues of linguistic justice in schools, so me and a colleague Dan at the EMC put together, and with Claire, put together a collective of teachers that we called the CLAW group, which stands for Critical Language Awareness. And right from the offset, like Claire played like a really important role in that. Like she was one of the most kind of active and energetic members of the group. Um, the numbers dwindled over time. Like we started off with around 50 teachers, and then that remained about a group of 20 kind of core teachers. And we met together like pretty informally, right, Claire? Like always online. The purpose of the collective was really to bring together teachers who had a shared interest in doing critical work about language in schools. And we're kind of very conscious of some of the dominant discourses of deficit that were circulating in society and in national policy. And that really worried them, but wanted to do something about it and to draw on historical efforts to push back against it. So as part of that collective, we applied for some funding for the British Association of Applied Linguistics to do some kind of case study work of teachers who were involved in that collective and were doing that kind of work. And again, Claire was a really central person to that. And that project involved spending some time in Claire's school up in the northeast, collaborating with her on the design of educational materials that she was using to teach Key Stage 3. And like thinking together about children's engagement with those materials and kind of refining them accordingly. So I guess like the collaboration that me and Claire and the other teachers who are part of that group have then is like a real joint interest and a real commitment to doing critical language work and pushing back against some of those very dominant language ideologies which we know circulate in schools. And like we've been lucky enough to have some funding for this work, but it's never been a huge amount really. We just kind of just had like smaller pots of money along the way. So I guess it's always been pretty grassroots in nature, like the collaboration, like it's never been particularly formal. We've done lots of little projects in classrooms and local schools. And I guess at the core of that, and really what hangs it together, is teachers and academics working together to locate those spaces for resistance, right? So those spaces in the curriculum where like more critical and anti-deficit language work might kind of creep in. And we've never tried to engage with policymakers. We've never been interested in working with policymakers particularly. It's always been a bit more kind of local community organising basis, a bit more grassroots than that. And yeah, that like cracks in the system metaphor that I alluded to has been really powerful. I think is that part of the title of the event, Elizabeth, right? Like when you know that you have teachers who are working within a really difficult system, and that system feels like it's really defined by very oppressive language ideologies, then what are the cracks in that system? Like, what are the spaces for resistance? And those spaces do exist, but they can be quite difficult to find. And I think the collaboration has really located and importantly really like widened those cracks. Yeah, I think that probably gives you the headlines of how everything came about and how it's held together.
Yeah, and I think also from my point of view, just before we got the Clare group together, there was a free online lecture, and I'm going to show you a fantastic book by Dr. April Baker-Bell, and it was hosted by the English and Media Centre in London, and I was on that call with some of my colleagues, and we're all A-level English language teachers, so of course this was just, wow, it blew us away, her approach, her pedagogy, what she'd done in classrooms, and we came off that call thinking, well, you know, we want to do that lower down the school. We don't want that to be just kind of A-level. I mean, no, by no means was she saying that, but that's where the space was in our school, in our curriculum at the time. So you know, we were thinking, right, Key Stage 3, how are we going to start? What's our curriculum going to look like? And how are we going to build on that through Key Stage 3? And then Ian and Dan, as Ian mentioned, started this hosting a Clare group, and really I think that was the transformational moment, because we'd been to that lecture, we were keen, there were ideas in the book we bought, but really the impetus then for us to kind of think about how are we actually going to put that in practice in our context, the northeast of England. She's there in Detroit. You know, what are some of the sort of things we can take from that? But the Clare group was really, really powerful for me. I mean, it was a group of teachers, as Ian said, who were all seeking to challenge linguistic injustice in schools in some way. So we're all like-minded. And we all had very, very different contexts. So there were some teachers on the group who were in schools where there were punitive policies around student language, spoken language. And perhaps they were hoping to work at the policy level with SLT in their school. So they were talking about that. Then there were teachers like me who were thinking about how can we embed this in our curriculum and enliven our curriculum, doing that really important work with students. So we actually devolved, we had a few subgroups at one point, but every time we met, which was regularly, every half term, we had an online meeting. Ian and Dan would provide some reading material before, so then we could have a discussion about some of the latest research. Obviously, we're all quite familiar with the work that Ian was doing as well. And it was just that space to think critically and collaborate with other teachers as well outside your own institution, which was really quite powerful. And Ian, you talked about there establishing some pedagogical principles, and I was looking back through my notes from the early meetings, and there was one which again was completely instrumental for the work we did in our school, and it was when you talk through some questions you might ask about thinking about language, and I've written down sort of the 3 powerful questions that we drew from that and we use all the time now in our classrooms. And I assume this has come from something that you do with your students at university as well, but when you're discussing language injustice, you said, well, we should always be asking, well, why is it like that? Okay, and how? And is it right? Sorry, actually the how was, how does it make you feel, I think. So there's 3 little questions that for me, I took away and was so important. So when I was talking to staff about, you know, when we're my colleagues, when we're going to sort of do some lessons explicitly on language justice, you know, some of the things that the students are going to come up with, we've got these 3 questions here. Well, why do you think it's like this? How does it actually make you feel? And is it right? And they have stayed with us as a way of giving us that critical lens really in the classroom. So I don't think I've ever really mentioned that to you, Ian, but that was sort of extremely powerful in the way of in sort of helping us think about how we put that into practice in the classroom. So I've written that down in my notes here. Yeah, so you know, we developed some work at my school. We started with year 7. I came back to the group and I shared some of the things they were doing. And I know a colleague on the group in a very different school in Cumbria took that, and they went away and did kind of their own version, which was brilliant. And then when they presented on that, that in turn gave me some ideas. So that kind of reciprocity between teachers as well was great. So then I could feed that back into my scheme of work, thinking, oh yeah, I really like the way you, so I think they explicitly labelled their scheme of work language injustice or language prejudice. We hadn't done that. We just call it, you know, studying spoken language. I thought how powerful just that label was, which then we went back and kind of adjusted what we were doing. So just that sharing between and evolving schemes of learning and ideas was kind of really powerful. But that group was really sort of a catalyst, I think, for establishing that work in the classroom.
Great. What brilliant answers. Okay, so second question then, which we thought Claire could start with. Can you tell us a bit about how your collaboration works and perhaps the challenges as well as the pleasures?
I mean, certainly there's been a lot of collaboration online through social media. So when Ian shared something or there's some new research papers, I mean, that's been brilliant for me to then digest and think about how do we, you know, apply that in a classroom context to talk about spoken language, deficit views about language. So that sort of more academic research has been brilliant. But a lot of practical things, like Ian said, around resources as well. I mean, I've just mentioned those 3 questions that Ian came up with. But also you worked with the artist Wendy Wong and produced these fabulous cartoons, which are a great stimulus for getting students to think about power and language. And that's a really sort of practical example of something that Ian did, which then we took. Ian also visited school, which you know was great. We were so excited that Ian could come in for the day and visit our classrooms. And he dropped into about, I think, 5 or 6 lessons. And it was the time of year when we were teaching these sort of schemes of learning with our year 8 and our year 7. So I'm sure Ian will talk a little bit about that from his point of view. But we were quite excited just to you know, to bring it in and say, this is what it looks like in the classroom. This is what's happening. We had a very informal sort of lunchtime chat, didn't we, as well, with my colleagues who are all love teaching about spoken language critically with students, because students, you know, love it as well. So they're all very enthusiastic and everybody's got their own story about language. So I remember at lunchtime we had that big chat about my colleagues' experience of, you know, personal experience and anecdotes of language injustice. But I think that just shows how as a school and as a department, we're all really kind of invested in this and see its importance. And I think something that was really powerful for me on the day was I invited Ian to do a student panel. So we picked students from year 7 to 9. I don't know, maybe there's about 12 of them. And Ian ran, which was, it felt to me like a kind of university seminar with these students, but pitched perfectly for where they were at. And I just sat back and watched. And Ian sort of questioned them about their views about language, a bit about what they've been doing in the classroom. But that critical lens there, when he was saying to them, well, what about this? How about that? You know, and we went back to sort of, you know, the colonialism, which is where a lot of these, you know, ratio-linguistic sort of ideologies come from. But that was great for me to see Ian in action with secondary school students in our context. And that sort of dialogic kind of seminar style, which of course we do in the classroom, but this was a really special space with just a smaller number, and we were in the school library. So I said I would think there was a real buzz for us about having Ian in there, and yeah, we weren't expecting sort of, I don't know, feedback as in how well we were doing it, but I think some people would think, well, is Ian going to tell us, is this right type thing? But I think it was more just the conversations and for Ian to see it and for me to talk to him, because it was really useful for me because we did the lesson drop-ins together, so I could really reflect as well on what this is looking like in the classroom and what the students are coming up with and what they're saying about their language and how they feel about their language. And within our school, we don't have any punitive policies about students policing students' spoken language at all, but still they exist in the world where there are lots of deficit views. We're in the northeast of England, so a lot of them do have an urban northeastern accent, and we know how that is judged, and students do often internalise negative views of their own accent. But at the same time, we have students who don't have that local accent. So there's a lot going on in the classroom. But for me to be able to hear that in other people's classrooms and be an observer with Ian was really helpful. So that's some of the ways that we've kind of collaborated. So we've got the school visit. And you talked about challenges there. That's a hard one, I suppose. This is an area where we're always finding new things, we're always moving forward. Ian, I've seen you put on social media about some paper which is going to come out to do with the language around behaviour policies. So there's always new things to think about and new angles. You think, okay, right, is that relevant in my, well, it will be relevant in some ways, absolutely, but how might that impact our knowledge as teachers and the way we talk to students about language? So I wouldn't say it's an unwelcome challenge, it's a brilliant challenge that we're having our eyes open to this all the time through the research that Ian and other critical educational linguists are doing. So I'll just pause there for Ian to come in.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, it's so nice to just like hear some of those memories of that work that we did together in the school, and I know that we've got lined up in the future. I guess like what's always been important to me as an academic in terms of doing collaborative work is a very non-hierarchical way of thinking about knowledge production. So universities are interested in knowledge exchange and partnerships, and quite rightly so, but that often gets framed in a way which positions academics as somehow superior, and kind of whose role is to somehow simply like transmit knowledge that they've created like into teachers' heads, right? And I've very unfortunately I've witnessed firsthand a lot of academics doing that kind of work where it kind of really just feels like they're just motivated by it for their own self-interests rather than any genuine dialogue or co-participation in the research process. So it was important to us from the outset, and it's always been important to my work that we really rejected that model of knowledge exchange and engagement work with schools, where we were trying as hard as possible to reject and disrupt that hierarchical model. And of course, there's a really long history of genuinely non-hierarchical collaborative work between teachers and academics that we took inspiration from. So that partnership and that commitment to that partnership is reflected in the way that teachers, for example, have been named on research grants as co-authors of academic papers and reports, of co-producers of the analysis of data that emerges from doing linguistic justice work. And so it's really important from the outset that we have these clear kind of principles for doing collaborative work between, in this case, applied linguists and English teachers. And yeah, I guess I just continue to learn so much from Claire and the other teachers that I collaborate with, like especially in how we can translate sociolinguistic concepts and theory into classroom practice. So seeing how sociolinguistic theory, which can often feel quite abstract, like seeing how that begins to have material manifestations in classrooms in terms of what children are able to do with language and the way that they think and talk about language. That to me is really one of the great pleasures of doing this kind of work, you know, developing theory and then seeing that theory like come to life as such in classrooms like Claire's. So just sitting in classrooms and watching Claire teach and listening to children talk about language and linguistic injustice and the things that really matter to them, and seeing that the visible traces of the research that we do as applied linguists that has that reach into classrooms is really a huge pleasure and continues to be a core motivation of the work that we do. Of course, like there's challenges, you know, like one of the things that we continually come up against is the national policy context that teachers like Claire work in, which often feels quite ideologically opposed to doing critical language work, especially in the last 10 years, but we'll see where things are going to be in the next couple of years. A lot of my work has been in trying to point out the deficit thinking that underpins policy. And it can be very difficult for teachers to find those little spaces and those little cracks for resistance. And another practical challenge is funding, of course. It's obviously really important and has been really important to pay for teachers' time and travel and have them involved as much as possible in the research process. But that, of course, involves taking time away from the classroom, which often requires institutional support for this kind of work, which comes with its own sets of challenges as well. So yeah, Claire's school is very supportive of the work that she does. She has the kind of institutional backing for the work that she does, which is great, but that's not the case for all schools, unfortunately. I'll maybe talk a little bit more about that in the next question, about the kind of like what are the enabling conditions really to do linguistic justice work in schools in collaboration with teachers.
Great question. Okay, so moving on, thank you for that fulsome response to the second question. So moving now on to the third question, what are you able to do as a result of your collaboration, and or what have you learned? And if Claire would like to begin with her answer first. Thanks.
Well, I suppose very, very practically at classroom level in my school, we teach about spoken language critically, years 7 to 9, key stage 3. There was an element of staff training involved, and not all of my colleagues have a language background or a language specialist. So, you know, we worked a lot on that and sort of talking about what language injustice is and how it manifests itself and what we can do in the classroom to discuss it, but also make it loads of fun because students really enjoy talking about and reflecting on their own language. And I hope, I mean, I did one short blog post a while ago. I hope at some point I'll be able to write more about the other things we do, because we've slightly refreshed that as well. And Ian mentioned there the national, you know, policy context can be tricky. Well, I hope that we've shown, you know, as a bit of a model at our school that you can teach. I would say not just a crack in the system, there is a legitimate space for teaching about spoken language. It is a part of subject English. And the national curriculum will enable you to do that if you read it. It talks about students' knowledge of spoken English. It says a few things about standard English, which are problematic and a little bit inconsistent, but that's something to bear in mind. But there is absolutely the place for it there. And I mean, we started the webinar tonight. Ian was talking about back in 2020 when we first sort of made contact, when some schools were in the news for having their, you know, whatever they were banning students' types of language. But it's 2025 and I've seen exactly the same type of thing on school websites. You know, so again, it's not blaming any individual, but it's looking at the policy context and the impact it has on schools. I saw one recently that said, well, when students enter the school gates, they leave the language of the street on the street. And I'm thinking, okay, well, you know, we've got a huge narrative. We've got a discourse about belonging in school, haven't we? We've got an attendance crisis. The big thing is about how can we create a sense of belonging in schools. Well, to me, that's a very ironic way of gatekeeping. You know, you ask students to leave their language on the streets. What are you saying to them about belonging in your school? So, you know, I'm sure it would be quite difficult in that school perhaps to do the kind of work we're doing. But certainly, I hope in some ways we are there as a model that people could perhaps say, well, look, it's possible to do this. You know, there are other ways, there are alternative ways of you know, tackling this at classroom level. So yeah, it might be that some people have want some particular examples. Please do ask in the chat, and later on perhaps I could talk about some actual examples of things we do, if this sounds just a little bit abstract. But yeah, so I wanted to talk about that. Oh, and so what else happened? So Ian invited me last year to a conference at Sheffield University, and it was called it was a conference about literacies and language and future forward thinking and what it could look like in schools, universities. And he said, why don't you come and talk about your work? There's also a prize if you want to enter your school's work for that. But that was something that I'd never have considered, so I did go along. And Ian and Julia Snell were there as well. And it was just great to be part of something that I wouldn't normally have done. And I found it was really rewarding because there were some really relevant presentations to my work in schools. I was probably the only school teacher there. But just talked about sort of breaking down any kind of boundaries between higher education and school. And that was something that I did. And a few PGC tutors came up and said, we really like the work that you're doing. So it was really nice to get the feedback that some of those northern universities, people are using my work with their students. So there's kind of circularity to it there. What we're doing then feeds back in, which is something that Ian might sort of talk a little bit more about as well. And then we had the Oracy Commission last year. So I kind of thought, well, we've done a lot of work around knowledge about language, critical awareness about that language. So I suppose that sort of emboldened me to do a submission for that. And I sort of said to Ian, what does it look like? This is what I'm writing. And he said, yeah, gave me a bit of feedback on that. So there was a bit of joint thinking went into that as well. So all these extra things that you would never anticipate getting involved with and doing, which sort of broaden the sphere of influence isn't quite the right word, but sharing the practice more widely, I think. It just came out of that initial collaboration. Yeah.
You didn't say that you won the prize. You're being really modest.
No, I didn't mention that, did I? No. So, but yeah, so the university did recognise the work that we'd done, which I just thought was great because it gives us that kind of recognition to say to people, look, this work is important, and these people who have spent their life thinking about language, linguistics, this is their career as well, they're also recognising this. So in terms of taking the word and spreading it widely, that was a really nice thing to do. Although I had to talk a little bit about my career, and I realised on reflection that when I first started teaching about spoken language, I've always done it at Key Stage 3, always, right back from when I started in the 1990s, when the LINK project, so this government project which was abandoned, but it was at one point thought that we could teach students about language across the curriculum. So I just started teaching when that had been abandoned, but this folder existed in my school. So we were doing lots of teaching about language, not necessarily critically at that time, but yeah, doing things with tape recorders where we'd send students off to role play and tape themselves and talk about spoken language in different contexts. And wouldn't it be brilliant to bring that back in as well to the classroom? So at some point, I think that's something to look at, that's sort of analysing, how spoken language actually works, registers and sort of, I mean, we touch on that anyway, but all that joyful stuff of students, being really agentive with it as well and creative, which we do a bit of in our schemes of work at the moment, but could do more.
I should have mentioned that I know that Claire's talked a lot. It feels like Claire's kind of using the research that we produced together as well in her teaching, but there's a really nice circularity to that as well. So I teach a undergraduate unit at university called Language and Social Justice, and I use examples of Claire's work in the classroom to kind of give illustrative, very concrete examples of what linguistic justice work looks like in the classroom. And of course, what's nice for the students is that they've read the academic research that underpins that classroom practice as well. So there's a really nice, like circularity that's going on between academic scholarship and classroom practice as well. And I think like out was that work for me as an academic linguist. I've just learned a lot through our collaborations about like what what are the enabling conditions for designing and building linguistically just schools? Like, what do they look like? And I think that Clare's school is a really strong example of what might be possible in relation to linguistic justice. So it kind of offers us like a blueprint for doing this kind of work at a national level. When you have like an expert practitioner like Clare, but really crucially, and perhaps no surprises, but when you have really strong departmental and institutional support for that work that's going on in schools. So out of the BAL, the British Association of Applied Linguistics grant that we mentioned, one thing that came out of that collaboration was like what we called a typology for doing linguistic justice efforts. So just to try and capture what teachers' work looks like when they're engaging in what might be called kind of successful linguistic justice efforts. So the things that came out of that typology were, and this all came out of observations of what teachers are doing and conversations with teachers who are involved in that project. So the things that came out of that typology were things like the importance of community and the importance of collective. So teachers consistently being in dialogue with each other, with like-minded teachers and with academics as well, and learning from each other in an attempt to challenge that non-hierarchical model of knowledge production. Things like grassroots organising, so linguistic justice efforts from the ground up, done primarily in classroom by individual teachers. Teachers like Clare has alluded to, who were really seeing themselves as language activists, who were seeing the work that they were doing as actively political, and seeing their classrooms as political and wanting to bring in the politics of language into their classrooms rather than ignore it. And yeah, as I mentioned, crucially, that institutional support for this critical language work. So Clare had that real backing from management, which granted her this kind of like a more official license for doing this kind of work. Some teachers that we worked with they felt like they were doing it a little bit more in isolation because management hadn't necessarily given them that explicit kind of support. And Clare's school is one where like anti-racist efforts form a broad part of the work that they're doing. Clare, your school's got a kind of strong anti-racist commitment, right, in a manifesto for anti-racism, and linguistic justice efforts are obviously part and parcel of that. So thinking about linguistic justice efforts as part of like cross-movement solidarity work with anti-racist work and anti-ableist work and anti-poverty work that was going on in the school and the strong union presence that you have in the school, etc. Yeah, so through witnessing Clare's work, it's just been really inspirational to see how children and teachers working together have been trying to disrupt and reject dominant language ideologies and challenging widespread deficit thinking about marginalized children, drawing on some of those asset-based pedagogies which build on, I suppose, the natural linguistic dexterity and strength that all children have. And ultimately, with that managerial support, pushing for something a bit more transformative to what we know is actually a really inherently unjust system. So through those collaborations, I think I've probably come to understand what linguistic justice in schools might look like and how it might be realized. Like there's obviously some way to go and our efforts absolutely continue, but that's okay. You know, like linguistic justice is a complex issue which requires really long-term and complex solutions rather than overnight solutions. And I really do think collaboration is at the core of that. So the work that we've done so far has, like, as I've mentioned, has been funded by a number of kind of small different pots of money. And we've definitely been really grateful for that funding, and that kind of signals to us that funders are taking this collaborative work seriously and that they place real value on that. And over the last year, me and Clare and Julia Snell, a professor of sociolinguistics at Leeds, have been working on a much larger grant application where we're all named as co-researchers on that grant, just to try and scale up some of the work that we've been doing. A little bit like the Link project, actually, that Clare alluded to earlier in the early 80s. And that project names 10 schools as partners, so it has that collaborative principles at its core. So we're still waiting on the outcome, but after some really positive reviews, we've just got our fingers crossed and watched this space really. So yeah, the work continues, but I think I just want to reiterate that through that long-term collaboration and that commitment to collaborative dialogue, that's where we're really beginning to widen those cracks in that system and starting to do something really cool.
Could I just add one thing, just listening to Ian there, about sort of collaboration just within my school as well. I will say it wasn't just me who designed all these resources and thought about the curriculum and really hard. I had a team of people who worked with me and some excellent colleagues, and I do think that's just the way forward for departments. You know, try and get a team of people who can drive it forward. Because then you know, you've got their expertise, you can bounce ideas off each other. But I have some fantastic colleagues who were sort of 4 of us, then 3 of us after that. You know, and I learned as much from them, and I could give them input from the Clare group and other things as well. But there was some backwards, forwards, and I do think as a way of developing schemes of work, schemes of learning, it's just brilliant to work in a team. So I just wanted to add that in to make that clear.
Great, thank you very much. I just invite anyone in the audience, if they want to put questions in the chat, please do for Clare and Ian. There is one comment and a request. Please, could you share what linguistic injustice examples you came across in the classrooms and what practical ways you tackled this? Over to both of you.
Do you want to start, Clare?
Yeah. Okay. So one thing we do is we use some statements and we get students to discuss the statements and their view. So for example, we might say, I've never had my speech corrected or mocked by anyone. Do you agree or disagree? Give them a little bit of thinking time. Perhaps they turn to their partner and then share their initial ideas. And then we'll have a kind of a dialogic episode where might be sort of teacher led, perhaps, with the whole class together. Right, so who would like to start? What are your experiences? And you always get people who they always say, yes, I've been criticised or mocked or something about their language. So there's always a lot of ideas around the class. And then we go back to Ian's sort of 3 questions. Well, why do you think it's like that? And then that generates more. And they talk about, it brings you back to the dynamics of power, how institutions work. How does it make you feel? That's really important, isn't it? And it makes me feel sad, it makes me feel stupid, it makes me feel frustrated or angry. They're often the adjectives we hear. And then, well, is it right? So then you let them think about, well, what can we do about it? If it's not right, then what should we be doing about it? So we would use statements as a way to elicit experience from the class, and then we would build from there. So that's one example.
Ian, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you. Like lots of ways. I think so I think it's important to recognize that linguistic injustice doesn't just materialize through the kind of explicit banning or policing of how people use language. Like that certainly is a manifestation of linguistic injustice, but I think it's important to think of linguistic injustice as something a bit more structural, that's shaped by broader ideologies about language and legitimate users of language, and how those ideologies can often seem kind of common sense. So for me, like tackling linguistic injustices, and for the teachers that we've collaborated with, it's about that individual level, but it's also about something a bit more systemic as well. So focusing efforts on changing and disrupting entire systems as opposed to just changing individual minds has been a kind of focus of a lot of the efforts that we've done. So that might, for example, involve like developing new policies around language. It might involve looking at how issues of linguistic injustice are related to issues of anti-racism or disability injustice, for example, in schools, and just trying to think about linguistic injustice as a system rather than about something that just manifests individually.
Yeah. Could I also say something about sort of giving students knowledge about language, which was really powerful. So another thing we did when we were planning our unit of work was we talked to Professor Hall from Northumbria Uni, because we'd had links with him prior, and he gave us a really good idea. And he said, every time you hear deficit language in the classroom, so students using deficit terms, negative evaluation of language, like that's lazy, or that's bad, that's just stupid, reformulate it, challenge it. So, so that was really powerful for us as well, because if we ask students to sort of talk about their own language, which we always do, reflect on how you use language, is it different at home to how it is in school with your friends, all that kind of stuff, and then say, well, why are you saying that's lazy, or why is it bad English? So I think immediately tackling that evaluative language that they internalize and come out with all the time, which is why I think you can't teach about language neutrally, because you always hear this kind of negative language that they've absorbed about different varieties of language. So I think that was something that was really important for us, is to always respond to those terms if we hear them and reformulate them, and obviously then talk about the why you need to reformulate it and why you don't use that word. And we position students as linguists, so we say, well, linguists don't judge anything, they just describe language. So that's actually judging, isn't it, that terminology? So a linguist would say this. So we found that quite a sort of simple way as well of taking the judgment out of it. So sorry, just an extra thought.
Thank you. And it's so brilliant as well in incorporating the language of linguistics into the classroom, because as you know, it's quite marginalised in the GCSE or in the English curriculum. But anyway, someone has just commented saying, same here, the whole speak like a scholar mantra is prevalent in maths, according to somebody here. But there's another comment, another inquiry. Hi, Clare and Ian, great talk, thank you. I work with quite a nervous PGCE cohort who worry about challenging what they perceive to be the status quo in placement departments. Have you any suggestions of smaller ways we can get linguistic justice work into common Key Stage 3 units, Trojan horse style rather than standalone units? Good question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, literature is a great avenue in. I'm just thinking about, there's the John Agard poem, Hey Mr. Oxford Don, isn't there? So if you want to have a lesson, if you're doing a poetry unit, I don't know what thematically what it might be about, but you could do poems, because that's standalone and you get great rich discussion, don't you, from a poem. There is the TED Talk by Jamila Lyscott, 3 Ways to Speak English. If you don't know that, have a look at that. It's absolutely brilliant, where she code switches between her 3 different kind of vernacular styles, which straight away students will be like, yeah. Or if you're doing, if you're looking at persuasive writing, rhetoric, article writing, you will find lots of newspaper headlines about perhaps schools that ban slang, student youth language is lazy, so you can find lots of newspaper things that are quite provocative. So if you were doing a scheme of work looking at newspaper articles, perhaps you could do it that way. So my suggestion would be through a poem, through an article that perhaps could be part of a larger scheme of work. I'll keep thinking about that question. It's a good question. Yeah.
Ian, anything to add?
Yeah, I think Claire's suggestion of using literary text is a great shout. Like, literary texts to a lot of English teachers feel like a kind of safe genre to work with, whereas we know that for a lot of English teachers, knowledge about language and linguistics can feel a little bit intimidating sometimes. So seeing literary text as a kind of way in and like a springboard to discussing linguistic injustice, I think can be a really productive opportunity to do that. One of the teachers that I've collaborated with in the past, we worked together on a project. I've just put the link to something that came out of that project, and that's where we used a literary text that had kind of anti-Asian discrimination and racism at the core of the text, but another part of that text was around linguistic discrimination as well. And so the teacher and me identified that text as like a really good, fruitful opportunity to get conversations of linguistic injustice into the classroom, but through students studying a fictional text. And where students did that, of course, what they were then able to do is make connections between the fictional world of the text and their real experiences of linguistic injustice, of which there are many, but only really came to light as a result of them engaging with the fictional text. So I know that that is perhaps a bit more of a kind of standalone unit than some of the individual ways in that Claire was suggesting, which are brilliant suggestions. But like getting pre-service teachers, of course, to design a whole new unit is something that's super important, especially if they're perhaps lacking in confidence and want to do that challenge to the status quo. And bringing like research to those conversations and saying, look, this has happened before. It's tried and tested through collaborations with academics and teachers. Like, let me have a go at doing it. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Someone else has recommended the 6 o'clock news poem by Tom Leonard. He's saying it's great for this. Another comment says, just to say that our English trainees have found Claire's use of the idea of a linguistic footprint really powerful, both for their pupils and for themselves. And some have explored that idea with pupils in quite restricted departments. So Claire, can you just talk a little bit about the linguistic footprint idea?
Yeah, I suppose it's this idea that everybody has their own languages, language repertoires, and it's getting students to reflect on those different repertoires. So I suppose that comes under the banner of, valuing language diversity in your school and getting students to reflect on that. I do think there's a little bit of a danger with that, because you've got to go one step further, because that's not really challenging any deficit. It's a great thing to do. It's really important to reflect on linguistic diversity, and that's absolutely brilliant to hear Sarah say that they've used that. It's fantastic. So I would then say to trainees, again, if we're going one step further, you've got to be really careful about the word appropriate. Right? So what a lot of people fall back in and say, well, we speak that way then because that's appropriate. Yeah, we speak like a scholar because that's appropriate. Well, I think we need to be avoiding or being very cautious or challenging idea of appropriateness. So I think if you're working with trainees, I think the next challenge from there is, it's absolutely brilliant. Can we then, how do we talk about that code switching? Because it happens. But do we need to also address this idea that people come up with, we code switch because it's appropriate? Because that's often used against marginalised students' language in the classroom. And there's some fascinating research, I think, on its way. I don't know if you're aware of Lexis podcast, which is hosted by England Blog and Dan Clayton and colleagues. So they interviewed a postgraduate student called Katie Mansfield, and she's doing research on the cognitive load that was put on students in the classroom to speak in standard English. And I think this is going to be a real wow moment when the research sort of comes out, because her initial findings are, unsurprisingly, that if you are correcting students mid-flow, if you have this sort of restrictive requirement, speaking standard English, whatever that means, but if students are sort of trying to think about, how they should be speaking rather than what they want to say, the cognitive load and therefore the impact on learning is huge. So I think that's definitely something to sort of look out for. I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but I'm just thinking of things as
important.
we're talking. Yeah.
Okay, we've got about I just want to give Ian a chance just to say something, and then we're going to have to wind up. So Ian, just in a minute, if you've got something to add, it'd be nice to hear you say something in response to that.
Oh God, I don't know. I'm just thinking about what speak like a scholar means. Like, have we been speaking like a scholar now? I've just got no idea what that means. But I think that phrase points to like how like ideas about language like often get framed as these objective things that everybody can kind of mutually agree on, that they're these like empirically kind of definable and locatable things. like what is appropriate speech, what is standard speech, what is speaking like a scholar. Like they're not objective linguistic realities, they're ideological, they're ideological constructs. And I think as soon as you can get teachers to start thinking about and rejecting concepts like that on the grounds that they don't represent actual linguistic reality, then that's a really important starting point for doing some cool linguistic justice work.
Thank you very much. And can I just thank Claire and Ian so very much for coming along tonight. And you have illustrated so brilliantly the power and importance of collaborating between HE and schools, and just what exciting, amazing work. And I just hope it gets shared far and wide. And I'm glad that you're doing this, their bit for this. And we look forward to the exciting work you're doing ahead. So thank you very much. And if we could hear everyone applauding, I'm sure they would be. And back to Becky.
Thank you so much to Elizabeth, Claire, and Ian. That was fascinating. Thank you. We have one more thinking forward session taking place this term, and that will be in April, where we will investigate a project which is looking at the scientific reasons behind why reading fiction for pleasure is good for us. So do tune into that one. That's a collaboration between English language scholars and a neuroscientist and a psychologist. So thank you ever so much and enjoy your evenings, and we'll see you at the next one. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.